Okay, our next speaker is Ben Nichols. He is a division chief and also the coordinator of the Defensible Space and Vegetation Management Program with the Sonoma Lake Napa unit in CAL FIRE. Ben.
Good morning. What you're going to hear today is going to be a repeat of a lot of things you guys have heard both yesterday and today. So this is a reoccurring theme, but you'll see how all of these different applications come into interlace to protect you when the next fire happens, because it's not a matter of if, it's when. So those of you that aren't familiar with this photo, this is September 17th, 1923 in Berkeley. So the WUI problem, losing structures due to conflagration fires, is not a new thing. Those of you that are familiar with Sonoma County, this is the Fountain Grove area in 1942, and then again in 2017. We've talked about fuel loading with the different fuel types across the areas that we're looking to have fires across. And those of you that are up to speed on fire science, the tons per acre for that grass oak woodland that we started with versus the tons per acre with these subdivisions that are plopped on top. Probably a pretty significant change in fuel loading, correct? And when it comes to our wildland fires, firefighters have a list of priorities that we have to take care of when we're fighting a fire, to triage and prioritize what is the most important, because there's a lot of different things going on at the same time, right? So that comes down to life first and foremost. We're always going to go to life, then followed by property, and then the environment. So when we have an event like this, that in 1942, we had a grass oak woodland savanna that we could have put a firing operation on a road for a Hanley type fire coming down into Santa Rosa. Fast forward to 2013, we no longer have that opportunity. Hence a fire coming across Highway 101 and into Coffee Park. So as Chief Turbeville talked about yesterday, a typical wildland dispatch during peak fire season, any normal afternoon, this is a small 10-acre fire here in the Sonoma Lake Napa unit. And on that response, you're going to get dispatched one air tactical group supervisor that flies around in the plane and orchestrates the wildland aerial firefighting, 2 air tankers, and 1 helicopter, 1 battalion chief, 5 engines, 2 hand crews, and 1 bulldozer. You guys heard that yesterday. From our local government cooperators, you're going to get at least 1 chief officer and 3 fire engines with a water tender. But the question to you is this picture. Fire is approximately 10 acres, not a super significant fire, kind of a lazy column to it. You can see that there's some retardant that's already been dropped. How many structures do you see in that photo? As we go through this process, they start popping all over the place. And what started as a nice, easy grass oak woodland fire suddenly becomes a lot more interesting for that initial attack incident commander. Because at this point, instead of that 10 acres of grass oak woodland that's burning, he or she has 20 structures that they have to prioritize in that list of priorities that we have, right? Are there people in those homes? Do they need to be evacuated? Is the fire close to those homes that dictates that we take action on that fire that's threatening to burn that property? And then when we get all the way to the end, then it's back to perimeter control, because the best way to protect these homes, to defend them from this advancing wildland fire, is to utilize perimeter control and put the fire out. So Chief Bertelli talked about that yesterday, in that any fire in the state responsibility area at this point has a high loading of residential structures. And so tactics that we might be able to utilize in northern Lake County, where we don't have that high population density, are out the window in Sonoma County, because we have that high ratio of homes in the SRA. So Carol Leon Safford, who you're going to hear from in a little bit here, provided me this photo because it's a significant thing to think about, especially here in Sonoma County. A lot of your areas in the West County were developed at the turn of the century. They were summer cabins and ranches in an area that had a much different fuel loading than we have today. So this painting was painted by a gentleman who lived out in the Fort Ross area, Fort Ross Cazadero area of his property in approximately 1900. His granddaughter took a picture of that same ridge line that you can kind of see the top of the barn in the far right corner of that photo, and then the top of the barn there. So 1900, we have an oak savanna, and 2008, we have a bay laurel Douglas fir mixed conifer forest that has a much higher fuel loading than we did in 1900. And the problem is compounded into the fact that the Doug firs are prolific regenerators, and so we have a point where that oak woodland can't keep up with the firs. They are introduced to the area, they get established, they overtop the oaks, and now we have a decadent fir stand that is much less resilient to wildland fire than the oak woodland before it. So what does that mean? So every time I drive through Marin County, Chief Bertelli talked about every time the wind blows or his bread gets dry or his lips get chapped, he starts to get a little anxious. Every time I drive through Marin County on Highway 101 and I look to the west and I see these little roof lines sticking out of a major fuel loading along those coastal hills, Chief Turbeville gave you all the fire history in Marin County in the last 100 years. There's been a couple fires, right? That's going to happen again. We had the Vision Fire in 1995. We caught it at the Great Western Fire Break. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Great Western Fire Break, that's also known as the Pacific Ocean. So it's scary stuff, right? Because the Vision Fire starts at the bottom of Tomales Bay, burns over one ridge, and it hits the Pacific Ocean. Imagine if that fire starts on 101 in Nevada and has that same wind event on it. There's a whole lot more out in front of it and a whole lot more loss of life and property that's probably going to happen. So what do we call these homes? Right? And that's the unfortunate deal, is that before these subdivisions were put in place, we had a grass oak woodland, a savanna, oak savanna. I found some photos of Novato turn of the century, and it's just wide open. It's grass and some sparse oaks. And here you are, present day, with a much different fuel loading than you had at the turn of the century. It's been talked about through the symposium so far, but it's something that's near and dear to my heart, that the shock to this event was the loss of homes and property, or homes and lives and homes, correct? But if you look at the natural vegetation, significant fire, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres burned across the North State here during this event. But as you drive through Sonoma County, my office is over just south of Calistoga, so I drive Mark West Springs Road every day. Those oaks that were completely defoliated and cooked to a crisp during the October fires are already popping leaves again. They're on their way back. So you had areas, and it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but you have areas where you have a higher intensity fire, where you do have a more intense fire that burned through that area. But the bulk of the fire area, you'll notice that the canopy is still intact and there's still trees that have green leaves. It struck me as odd that first night, there's video footage of somebody driving through Fountain Grove, and you have fully involved homes with significant fire coming from these homes, and the vegetation around the homes is uninvolved because of that weakness in the home hardening, where that one ember got into that structure and cooked it from the inside out. And in these neighborhoods, as you can see, once that first structure goes, we have structure to structure ignition across that entire neighborhood. Because at that night, over 5,000 homes destroyed, right? During the peak of the October fires, there were a little over 1,000 fire engines on the fire line fighting those fires. 5,000 homes destroyed, not the ones that were saved. You do the math on fire engines to structures. That's 1 to 5 just for the structures that were destroyed, not to mention the ones that we were able to save. So that's where we have to rely on you to provide that defense and to do that work on the front side to prepare your home and your community for that fire that we know that we're going to have. So that being the case, one of my jobs in the pre-fire division is to prepare the overall unit for the fire that's coming. One last deal before I get off target on that is that during the wind event, we've talked about the conflagration fires. We've seen some very dramatic slides of what fires can do in the right conditions. In the 48 hours, the first 48 hours of the October wind event across the north region, so the entire north half of the state of California, CAL FIRE responded to 172 wildland fires in that time. Only 18 of those became large damaging fires. So we had a significant fire occurrence across the region. Our suppression forces did a great job. Unfortunately, during the conditions that we have, there's going to be those fires that get away. So those fires that get away, what do? We don't just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we can't do anything about it. My approach as the pre-fire division chief is to make sure that we have defensive belts or layers from those undeveloped wildland areas into your neighborhood, into your home, so that when we have those fires, you have some buffer before that fire hits. Because as we're going to talk about with defensible space, the idea of Public Resources Code 4291 as it relates to defensible space is not to protect you from the conflagration fire, the 1% of fires that are going to occur. It's that day-to-day fire, that 10-acre fire that we just saw a little while ago, where you have 5 fire engines coming and 20 homes around that fire. If those homes have the appropriate defensible space, it's much less exciting than it would be if we didn't have that defensible space around those homes. So something we've been doing in Lake County, those of you that are familiar with it, here approaching the middle of the screen is the top of Mount Canocti, and we have the Clear Lake Rivieras along the south end of the lake there. Chaparral fuel type, very high fuel loading. Lake County experiences regular afternoon west winds as the wind pushes across the lake from the west to the east. So Chief Bertelli, who you guys met yesterday, was very concerned about the exposure of these high density neighborhoods from a fire coming over the top of Mount Canocti into their neighborhoods. So what do we do about it? We worked with the Fire Safe Council up there and the state, CAL FIRE, working on fuel breaks around those communities. So the yellow lines you see in that photo are 300-foot buffers that we cut the chaparral out of that 300-foot buffer around that community to provide that community a fuel break between that wall of fire that would be coming from Mount Canocti into their neighborhood. We left specimen species so that there was some vegetation left in it, but the bulk of it, the brush, the chaparral component, was taken out so that there was that buffer between the community and the undeveloped wildland alongside. Something we haven't done, but as an example that we could do, is the red perimeter in the middle is the black forest. It's BLM land. And we could institute a broadcast burn prescribed fire in the black forest to limit the fuel loading in there, make that timber stand more resilient to a fire that would occur, that's going to occur at some point in time, and then link those two together. So not only do we have these fuel breaks around the communities, but we also now have an area that we can use for lower intensity fire once a fire ignites. So this is an aerial shot of the fuel break post-construction. You can see that there is some species that are left within the overall 300-foot area, but that there is a significant fuel break between that undeveloped chaparral and the community. I believe that's Clear Lake Riviera. So we talk about multiple layers. I talked to you just now about the landscape level in that fuel breaks, be it shaded fuel breaks, roadside fuel breaks, ridgetop fuel breaks, something to give fire control personnel a anchor point to work off of when we have that fire, to be able to provide that barrier between you and that approaching fire. Is it going to stop all fires? Absolutely not. But we have a whole lot of fires that are not the Tubbs fire, that would be a perfectly good tool for us to use to be able to contain a fire at 500 acres instead of 5,000 acres. So we have the landscape level fuel modification, be it mechanical or broadcast burning. And then we get down into the neighborhood level. Yana talked about it, that once that first structure in a developed area goes, it's a candle event as those structures burn from structure to structure to structure across that community. So we've done our deal on the landscape level. We rely on homeowners then at that point to make sure that they've got their defensible space around their home. And then tying into, Yana, once you get into the neighborhood proper, now everything you can do to prepare your home with hardening, be it screens or the other items that you can use to build your home with, is going to make your home that much more resilient, so that maybe you do get lucky if the neighbor's house goes, that your house can withstand that radiant heat coming off of that other fire. So CAL FIRE defensible space requirements, we're getting pretty short on time, so I don't want to bury you, but we have that information. The requirements are that we want to make sure that we've got limbs away from chimneys. The 4291 is not only for wildland fire into structures, but it's structures into the wildland. So that limb getting close to the chimney is more receptive to catching fire and then starting a wildland fire from the house. We want to talk about leaves and needles on the roof. Everybody's talked about that so far in the symposium. That's the #1 killer of structures, is that not maintaining those leaves and needles around the house. We got to get rid of all that dead grass within the 30-foot distance around the house. I'm sorry, the dead dying tree branches. So we don't want dead material hanging over the house because it's more receptive to structure fire into the wildland. We want to make sure that we get rid of all the grass within that 30-foot, the dead grass. We want to mow it. And that's within we used to call it the lean and green, but as Jeannie put out there, we don't necessarily want it green anymore. We just want it lean. We don't want a bunch of dead material that's going to allow fire to readily transition into your structure. We want to spread stuff out. We're not looking for you to clear cut your property. We just need you to create some spacing between your plants so that if one plant goes, it doesn't carry from the undeveloped area outside of your yard all the way into your house. Decks, we talked about decks. Everybody loves to store things underneath decks. Don't store things underneath decks. Wood piles, get it out of that 30-foot zone around the house. If you absolutely have to have it within distance of the house, because I get it, wintertime, you don't want to go out, farther than you have to, cover it with a fire-resistant tarp. Build a wood shed around it. Do something that gets it not exposed to those embers that are coming. So outside that 30-foot, we get a little bit taller on the grass. The whole idea is just reducing that fuel load so that we don't allow that fire to charge into the house. We want to thin out material. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on here. And then if we do have wood piles out in that area, we want to make sure it's cleared down to bare mineral soil around that pile for 10 feet. I suggest maybe a long-term is more dollars up front, but it saves you for regular maintenance. Is maybe you pour a concrete pad and put the wood on the pad, or a rock patio, rock brick area. So we can have dead material out in that 70 to 100 or 30 to 100 foot range, but we don't want it accumulated more than 3 inches of material. So you can have some pine needle litter, you can have some fine branches, but you want to get rid of those logs. You want to get rid of the large dead material. Any logs or stumps within the 100 foot all the way to the house, you want to get rid of, because that's just a great ember catching glove. And then propane tanks. Don't make life more exciting once that fire comes through the neighborhood. And it gets neglected because there's not a lot of space underneath a lot of propane tanks, but get that wire rake underneath there, get all the pine needles and oak leaves and grass taken out from underneath the propane tank. And then we've hit it a couple times during the symposium thus far. If we can't find you, we can't help you. 80% of the calls are going to be medical in nature and time is of the essence. That address not only helps us in a wildland fire, but it helps you with a medical emergency. And then screen openings to protect fire from a fireplace coming out into the wildland. So when we're talking about that 30 to 100 foot distance, we want things up. We want to prevent the fire from transiting from the ground into the canopy of the trees, because it becomes a much more exciting fire at that point and much more likely that it's going to burn your structure, right? So perfect case, we'd say minimum of 6 feet off the ground, mow underneath it, and you're not going to get the fire up into the top of that tree. If you have to have the bush underneath it, we want a separation between the top of that bush and the bottom branches of the tree 3 times the height of the bush that's underneath it. And then as it relates to slopes, you want to make sure that you have spacing. The whole idea is to spread your canopy out so that you're reducing the likelihood of that fire to readily transmit from the undeveloped areas around your house into the house. So as you can see with the graphic, we got more information in the back. On flat ground, minimum of 10 feet. As it transitions to a steeper grade, you need a greater distance between those items of vegetation. And just real quick before we end it, CAL FIRE has identified that this is a problem. We don't want to destroy any more structures than we absolutely have to. And so 2016, we began, we were staffed, funded for limited term defensible space inspectors. And so we utilize defensible space inspectors to conduct inspections in the SRA, and they're documented on an online application, which allows us to better record what our issues are out there and better develop information for a pre-attack map. So to go with this is kind of a zoomed in scale. As you can see, green inspections are homes that passed the inspection, their first inspection. Purple you probably can't see very well, are locked gates that our inspectors couldn't get past. Gold stars are inspections that occurred historically, and yellow and red indicate subsequent inspections that are taking place. Thank you very much for your time.
We've got time for 1 or 2 questions.
There's been a lot of discussion about burning as a tool for vegetation management. I haven't heard as much about mechanical vegetation management. Could you say a little bit about in which settings one or the other may be more appropriate, or especially mechanical management? Where is that? What settings is that most effective and appropriate?
Excellent question, Kate. I'm glad that you asked that. There's been a large push that prescribed fire is the one-size-fits-all tool to fix what we've experienced in the October fires. That is not the case. We have a large elephant to consume in that we're 100 years behind where we should be with our fuel loading in and around the state. So it's a multifaceted tool that we need to approach this problem with, and mechanical is just as much of a valuable tool as broadcast burning across the landscape level. So what currently the fuel loading here in the Sonoma Lake Napa unit, we have identified one of the major issues for us is the life safety component, right, when it comes to wildland firefighting. And so at that point, ingress egress is a major concern for us. I am very proud that our roads were able to support the load of traffic coming off the hills the night of October 8th, but it could have been far different. Currently, Sonoma Lake Napa units working with California Conservation Corps to do roadside fuel reductions on Fitch Mountain, Sweetwater Springs, and Highway 29 over to Lake County. And that work that was done in years past was part of the control line that we used for the tubs that prevented the Tubbs fire from coming across Highway 29 and burning back down into Calistoga like the Tubbs did into Santa Rosa. So thank you for that.
So we're gonna hold off till the big discussion at the end because we're running out of time for this time. So thank you very much, Ben. That was great.